Very good evening, everyone. Welcome to a very special Around Sound series. We are going to be exploring over the next 4 sessions, perhaps the greatest of all composers. And I know people out there would argue, surely Mozart, Beethoven, Handel. Well, pretty much to a man, they would all agree with me that Johann Sebastian Bach is the master of all. And so over the next 4 weeks, I say, we'll be exploring his life. I've got some questions for you all before we start, keeping with the Around Sound tradition. And of course, by the end of our session this evening, hopefully you'll be able to answer these questions. Session 1 questions. Our first one is, whose scores did the young Bach steal? He stole some scores. Who was the mysterious woman in the organ loft? And furthermore, what was she doing up there with Bach? Question 3. Why did Bach spend time in jail as a prisoner? And finally, for what reason did Bach leave Cöthen? I mean, you might think, who on earth was this man? Why are we calling him the Fifth Evangelist? Well, that is a very good question, and we will answer it tonight and over the next 4 weeks. We're going to go with Bach in a bit of a whistle-stop tour through his early and midlife to Leipzig, where, of course, he became the legendary figure that we know him today. He is, in many ways, this is his origin story, the superhero composer, everything that leads to him taking flight for the first time as the cantor at the Thomaskirche. So tonight we're going to explore what led him to Leipzig. Next week we'll look at the sacred architecture, and this is looking at the big works, the Passions of St. Matthew and St. John, and another one which you may not have heard of. We're going to be looking at his masses, the B minor and more, as well as the Christmas oratorio and the other monolithic music. Before week 3, we'll be talking about coffee and cantatas, the weekly grind, both of coffee beans and of producing some of the world's most exquisite music at almost breakneck pace. And then the final session I've called the Final Fugue, as we look at Bach as an elder composer at the end of his life, and yet he managed to achieve some of the most extraordinary musical feats of his entire career in his final years, including thumbing a nose at an emperor, embarrassing this man utterly, and leaving a legacy that no one could follow, so much so that the only thing that people could do was to reinvent music entirely. Bach made such an impact on the world, and it's fair to say few humans have ever impacted the world in a way that Bach has. So tonight's session, there's a little bit of an outline there. I'm not going to read it all out, other than to say I've got a lesson plan. And we're going to go through it all. A couple of things leap out here, though. Bach's starstruck trek, Bach's big boozy bar bill, fighting the nanny goat bassoonist, the secret tryst, the duel that never was, a new hope, settling for the mediocre. This doesn't sound like a rarefied figure to me. It doesn't sound like a god. This sounds, everyone, like a man. And he was a man. He was just as human as any of us. Now, before we get started, those of you who have signed up to this course, and hopefully you all have, you'll see in the course area on the choirlibrary.com website a playlist, and all the tracks I'm playing tonight are there, and they're from YouTube, so you can enjoy them in full. There are also some interesting links and some articles that you can read that go into more depth. And I have recently acquired this book in the last year. It's by John Eliot Gardner, who of course is one of the greatest living exponents of Bach's music today, and it is a very good read. To be clear, this is partly John Eliot Gardner's autobiography and a very, very detailed exploration of Bach's life. And so as you're reading it through, bear in mind he does talk about himself quite a bit, but to be fair, this very famous portrait of Bach, which you see here in close-up, was hanging on John Eliot Gardner's wall throughout his childhood, the original. So, we'll cut him some slack. Worth a read. Music in the Castle of Heaven. I would also say that there are plenty of second-hand copies available online if you're not a fan of John Eliot Gardner and his tendency of attacking bass soloists. But anyway, let's talk about Bach, the great cantor himself. And we all know the music of Bach, that music that played at the very start. We know it as Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring. It actually comes from Cantata 147, Jesus bleibet meine Freude. This is one of his best known melodies, and it is typical of Bach's writing. It's ornate, it's elaborate, it's really hard to whistle, unlike the music of, say, Handel or Vivaldi. And we all know how beautifully Bach could write, whether it was the famous air on the G string or his passions, even his organ music. That toccata in D minor, for example, is essential. He's considered to be the father of Western music. He's achieved an almost godlike status in the pantheon of great composers. He was, of course, as we've already heard tonight, not a god. He was as human as the rest of us. And just in general, I passionately believe that this 19th century idea of deifying composers, putting them literally on a pedestal, visualize where you've seen Bach before. I'm sure you've seen images, or even in real life, a sort of marble bust of Bach sitting on a shelf, just like the ancient Greeks and the Romans used to build statues of their gods. In the 19th century, we put composers on a pedestal, and it does a disservice to them, because in a way it cheapens their work, their industry. Bach was a most industrious composer. It also does a disservice to us all because it keeps them at a distance. And what I'm going to aim to do tonight is to show you that Bach was not just human, but he was so human that the music he produced, it wasn't, well, he would have said it came from God. I would say that aside from a touch of divine inspiration, it came from the circumstances of his life, to the extent that he could do nothing but produce this music. It was inevitable given his circumstances, and frankly a whole lot of hard work. Now, where does Bach sit in the pantheon of composers? Well, in the eras of classical music, starting in the medieval era, which is the longest, and the 20th and 21st century, which is down there at the bottom, he is firmly in the middle there. The Baroque era, which began around about 1600 and ended in 1750. Now, we say, generally speaking, it started around 1600 because that was the birth of opera, and that was Monteverdi and his first big opera, which was Orfeo, around about that time. We say 1750 because that's the death of J.S. Bach. He was so essential, as I've already said. The Baroque era finished because he did too. And let's be clear, Bach did not invent Baroque music, but he perfected it by pulling together various disparate threads. Let's have a quick look at how he synthesized various elements from across Europe to create something new. First of all, over there on the left, well, there's the Red Priest himself, Antonio Vivaldi. And there were so many elements of Vivaldi's music that were brought into Bach's music. You have the driving rhythmic vitality, you have concerto form, you have things like ritornella form and the walking bass, all of which were features of Vivaldi's music. You have the French school, which is typified by composers like Marchand and Lully, a formal elegance and a grace, this idea that royalty is associated with dotted rhythms. This comes from France. The dance suites, the collection of tunes and songs from around Europe with their different forms and collected together to delight royalty and aristocracy. This came from France and, of course, directly influenced Bach's own suites. And then you have the North German school, where, of course, Bach was born and where he spent most of his life. And this was typified by the music of the Danish composer, for example, Buxtehude. And this has dramatic structural rigour. Everything is very well built and well constructed, as you would expect from a German tradition. But you also, on top, have this fantastical organ tradition. We'll talk about it a bit later, something called the Stilus Fantasticus, which sounds like a Harry Potter spell, but is absolutely phenomenal. And all of these elements together created a new language through Bach. He couldn't help but express himself in these terms because, having been exposed to each of these particular structures and these particular threads, he would produce this amazing tapestry of music. And what did Bach bring to the world of music. Why do music students around the world, regardless of their native tongue, if they are learning Western classical music, they will study the music of J.S. Bach, whether they're playing the keyboard, whether they're playing an oboe, whether they're playing the violin, whether they're composing, everyone studies Bach. Well, first of all, he developed this idea of counterpoint, these interweaving lines, the threads of the tapestry, to the extent that he produced the most exquisite fugues. No one could do better, at least not for hundreds of years. He came up with innovations in functional harmony, the way that we use chords, a language of chords that creates a lexicon, a vocabulary, so that it's not just which chord could follow, it's which chord must follow, so that there is a flow to music that is so obvious that if something goes wrong, you hear it straight away. But if you don't hear anything goes wrong, you're drawn in by this language. And through his efforts and his industry and everything we're going to talk about tonight, he revolutionized choral music, particularly sacred choral music. But he had a couple of tricks up his sleeve in the secular world as well. So Johann Sebastian Bach, the master of counterpoint, tonality, sacred choral works, and all of the features that make the Baroque era so impactful. In the Baroque era, a lot of music was derived from a single melodic idea, a little cell, sometimes a bar, 2 bars. This idea was worked and reworked. You would have an introduction of an idea, which would then be repeated and then changed the 3rd time. Baroque music had a rhythm that was continuous. This idea, if you look at the example here, a bit of scarlatti, a constant rhythm, like a stream running past a water mill, for example, often with little or few rests, just the sense of once the music had started, it would continue until it reached its end. Unlike the music of the Romantic era, which would start and stop depending on the composer's whim and the emotion and how they felt that particular Tuesday, Baroque music has a drive that can't be denied. And in terms of dynamics, the louds and quiets of music, Baroque music generally is what we call terraced. So rather than, again, the gradations and the subtleties of Romantic music, the music of Beethoven and Chopin, where music could suddenly get very quiet and then suddenly get very loud and everything in between, here it is just well built. A loud section might be followed by a quiet section, but generally speaking, there's no subtlety. It's loud or quiet, and sometimes you would just have an entire movement that was loud or an entire movement that was quiet. This term is terraced. Now, we've spoken about the polyphonic texture, this idea of interweaving lines, counterpoint, which Bach was the master, but Bach also was a master of homophonic texture, chords. And we're going to hear a lot of those in the 3rd section when we're talking about cantatas. And if you've ever studied music, you'll be familiar with 4-part chorales. And I have a book here that was given to me by my music teacher when I left school. It used to belong to him, and now it belongs to me. And I have had this for more than 30-something years. And it is falling apart because both he and I spent a lot of time playing these chorales. These simple melodies, popularized, practically invented by Martin Luther. The way that Bach harmonized these tunes was so important, so integral, that composers, as well, to this present day, still learn how to do it in the style of Bach. So really, he was a master of form, of structure, of mood, and this is why we call him the Fifth Evangelist. Not just because of his compositional techniques, but because of what he did and how he used these techniques in the world. It wasn't to become a composer of opera or of secular music. It was all about driving his faith and about being driven by his faith.